The oldest Mesopotamian creation stories contain a strange idea about humanity. People were not simply brought into existence to live, prosper, and disappear. Their creation was connected with a problem inside the divine world itself. The gods had work to perform, and some of that burden had become unbearable. Then humans appeared as the solution. But that is only the beginning. If the gods needed humanity for labor, why did human beings later become builders, scribes, priests, and keepers of sacred memory? The answer may reveal that human purpose was far more complex than simple service. Where are you watching? The world before humanity appears in the ancient Mesopotamian creation traditions. The divine world is already active. Gods have responsibilities, territories, temples, and duties connected with maintaining existence. Yet one problem stands out: exhausting physical work. The Atrahasis tradition, preserved in Akkadian, describes lower-ranking gods carrying the burden of difficult labor. They dig canals, work the land, and perform tasks needed to keep the divine world functioning. Their work becomes a serious burden. Eventually, the workers refuse to continue. Their complaint creates the central problem of the story. If the gods will no longer perform this labor, someone else must take their place. That is where humanity enters. The creation of humans is therefore connected with a practical need. Human beings are introduced as a way to relieve the divine workers from duties that have become exhausting. Their existence has a purpose before they even begin building cities or creating written records. This detail changes how the creation story can be understood. Creation myths can do more than explain where life came from. Mesopotamian traditions also explain why people have responsibilities, why work exists, and why society is organized around roles. For ancient communities, work was never abstract. Fields had to be prepared, seeds had to be planted, crops had to be harvested, canals needed maintenance, food had to be stored, settlements required protection. Every season brought tasks that could not simply be ignored. Mesopotamia depended heavily on organized agriculture and irrigation. The rivers could make the land productive, but controlling water required constant effort. A broken canal could damage fields. A failed harvest could threaten an entire community. The creation story places these realities inside a divine framework. Humans become workers within an already existing order. The ancient writers did not imagine people as machines. Humans had families, communities, rituals, fears, ambitions, and relationships with the divine. Their role was part of a wider social structure. The gods also had roles. One deity could be associated with wisdom. Another could be connected with kingship, storms, fertility, warfare, or a particular city. Divine power was distributed across different functions. Humanity occupies another position inside this larger arrangement. People work. People produce. People maintain. Their activity supports a world that the gods have already established. The distinction matters because it prevents a simple conclusion. Humans were created only to suffer. The texts do not present human existence as a modern theory of meaningless labor. They present work as a necessary function within a sacred and social system. Labor connects human beings with agriculture, settlement, food production, and eventually religious institutions. The creation story is not identical to every Sumerian tradition. Mesopotamian literature developed across centuries, languages, and cities. Some traditions survive in Sumerian, while others were written in Akkadian and adapted older ideas. That distinction is important. Atrahasis should not be presented as one isolated Sumerian tablet containing every answer about human origins. It is part of a broader Mesopotamian tradition in which questions about creation, divine responsibility, mortality, and human purpose repeatedly appear. The surviving texts are not one consistent book. They are fragments of a long tradition. Writers emphasized different concerns. Some focused on creation. Others explored kingship, wisdom, floods, death, or relationships between gods and cities. Yet one pattern remains striking. Humanity is repeatedly placed inside a world that already has structure. People do not arrive to invent purpose from nothing. They inherit responsibilities. They enter relationships. They become part of institutions. The first responsibility connected with their creation is work, but work alone cannot explain what humanity eventually becomes. Once humans begin producing food, maintaining settlements, and participating in sacred institutions, their role expands beyond the original task. The solution to the god's burden begins creating something much larger. That is where the next layer of the mystery begins. The first human task may have been work, but Mesopotamian tradition gives that task a wider purpose. People did not simply replace exhausted divine workers and then disappear into the background. They became part of a relationship linking agriculture, worship, temples, and the gods themselves. This relationship can be seen most clearly through offerings. Ancient Mesopotamian temples were active institutions. Priests performed rituals, workers prepared goods, animals were cared for, grain was collected, and supplies were distributed. Such systems depended on organized human activity. A farmer could grow barley, a shepherd could raise animals, a craftsman could produce tools, a scribe could record deliveries. Each role contributed to a larger structure that connected ordinary life with religious practice. Food, drink, animals, oils, and other goods could be presented during rituals. These acts were not simply meals for supernatural beings. They expressed respect, obligation, and the continuing relationship between people and their deities. When ancient texts say, in effect, that the gods required human service, they were not necessarily describing helpless beings who could survive only by physically eating what humans produced. The idea is broader. Human activity maintained the institutions through which divine worship continued. Without farmers, there would be less food. Without craftsmen, temples would lack necessary objects. Without priests, rituals could not be performed. Without scribes, records and traditions could disappear. Human society therefore became part of the sacred system. This creates a strange relationship. The gods are presented as superior to humans, yet their presence within the human world depends upon human participation. People need divine protection, fertility, kingship, and order. At the same time, the religious system expects people to maintain temples, perform rituals, and provide offerings. The temple was more than a place where people prayed. In ancient Mesopotamian cities, temples could also function as economic and administrative centers. They controlled resources, employed workers, stored goods, and organized ceremonies. Religion and daily life were not separate categories. They overlapped. A harvest could be agricultural success and a divine blessing at the same time. A king could be a political ruler and a figure whose authority was presented as divinely approved. A temple could be a sacred building and an institution managing resources. Humanity operated inside all of these connections. This is where the role of Enki becomes important. In Sumerian traditions, Enki is associated with wisdom, craft, water, intelligence, and knowledge useful to civilization. His stories repeatedly place him close to the forces that make organized human life possible. The concept of the me adds another layer. The term is difficult to translate with one perfect English word, but it can refer to divine powers, ordinances, or functions associated with civilized existence. Rather than treating it as a simple list of magical objects, it is more useful to understand the me as part of a larger idea. Civilization has an ordered structure. Human beings participate in that structure. They farm, they build, they trade, they write, they worship, they govern. The original burden placed upon humanity therefore grows into something more complex. Humans are no longer simply taking over unpleasant work from the gods. They are maintaining a society through which the relationship between the human and divine worlds can continue. Their purpose now reaches beyond physical work. Yet this arrangement creates a problem. A population created to support the divine order can grow beyond the limits expected by that order. More people produce more activity, more settlements, and more noise. The same human society that solves one divine problem can eventually create another. That tension becomes central to the flood tradition. Humanity was needed, then humanity became difficult. And the reason for that change reveals something important about how ancient Mesopotamians understood the limits of human existence. When humanity became a problem, the tension appears when the atrocious tradition turns from creation toward destruction. Humanity has already served the purpose for which it was created, yet the growing population becomes a new problem for the divine world. Those who needed human labor now decide that human expansion must be controlled. People multiply across the land. Settlements become larger. Human activity becomes louder and more widespread. The text presents this growth as a disturbance to the gods. Eventually, a decision is made to reduce humanity through a catastrophic flood. At first, the story seems contradictory. Why would the gods destroy the very population they had created to perform necessary work? The contradiction is important. It shows that humanity was never presented as an independent force with unlimited freedom. Human beings existed within boundaries established by the divine world. Their usefulness did not make them equal to the gods, and their growing numbers could become a threat to the order those gods represented. The flood becomes more than a disaster. It becomes a test of the relationship between divine power and human survival. Yet the divine world itself is divided. Enki, later known in Akkadian as Ea, warns Atrahasis rather than allowing the destruction to become complete. The story does not present every deity as sharing one identical intention. That disagreement matters. It shows that Mesopotamian mythology could imagine divine beings with different interests, decisions, and responsibilities. The gods are powerful, but their world is not always simple or perfectly unified. Atrahasis survives. Humanity survives with him. The world continues within the wider Mesopotamian imagination. This survival creates another question. If the flood was intended to reduce humanity, why preserve even a small human population? The answer becomes clearer when the wider Mesopotamian system is considered. Human society was useful. People cultivated fields. They raised animals. They maintained settlements. They performed rituals. They produced offerings. Without a human population, the institutions connecting the gods with earthly life would disappear. The flood could therefore reduce humanity without eliminating it completely. The story preserves a limit. Humans can be punished, limited, and destroyed in great numbers, but they remain necessary. The ancient writers were not describing population management in a modern scientific sense. The flood story belongs to a tradition concerned with mortality, judgment, environmental danger, and fragile civilization. Mesopotamia itself was shaped by rivers. The same waterways that supported agriculture could also threaten settlements. Flooding was a real danger for communities living in low-lying regions. Myth transformed that danger into a story about the relationship between humanity and the divine. The flood also reveals something about human vulnerability. People can build cities, organize agriculture, and develop complex institutions, yet a disaster can destroy what generations created. Civilization is powerful, but it is fragile. That fragility may explain why ancient traditions repeatedly connect human beings with divine protection. Humans can create order, but they cannot control every force around them. The story does not end with destruction. Atrahasis survives. Human life continues. The divine relationship continues, and humanity returns to the activities that define its place in the world. This is where the original creation purpose begins to change meaning. If humans were created because the gods needed labor, then the survival of humanity after the flood suggests that labor was not the entire purpose. Something else had developed. People were now maintaining settlements, traditions, rituals, and knowledge that could survive beyond individual lives. The flood destroys people. It does not erase the human role. That distinction becomes crucial. The ancient story has moved from creation to crisis, but the deeper question remains unanswered. What did humanity become after it had fulfilled the first task given to it? The answer is found not in another act of divine creation, but in what humans built for themselves. The answer begins with something the creation story never fully explains: civilization itself. Humans were introduced to perform necessary tasks, but their activity produced institutions far more complex than simple labor. They built settlements, organized agriculture, developed administration, and eventually created writing that could carry knowledge beyond one person's lifetime. A field could be planted by one generation and harvested by another. A temple could be repaired by people who had never met its original builders. A city could survive the death of its rulers. Human activity created structures that outlasted individual workers. This matters because Mesopotamian civilization was connected with organized institutions. Cities had temples and patron deities. Kings governed communities. Priests performed rituals. Farmers produced food. Craftsmen created objects. Scribes recorded transactions and traditions. Each role supported another. The farmer produced grain. The administrator counted it. The temple received part of it. The scribe recorded the transaction. The priest used the resources and ritual. The system could continue because human beings transmitted knowledge from one generation to the next. Writing transformed that process. Before written records, information depended heavily on memory, speech, repetition, and demonstration. Once scribes began pressing signs into wet clay, names, agreements, prayers, accounts, laws, and stories could survive beyond the people who created them. A clay tablet could outlive a king. That possibility changes the meaning of human purpose. The gods did not need humans only to perform individual tasks. Human society could create systems capable of preserving those tasks, institutions, and traditions across time. This is also where kingship becomes important. Mesopotamian kings were not presented simply as individuals with personal power. Their rule could be connected with divine approval, temple maintenance, warfare, justice, and protection of cities. A ruler died, but kingship continued. A priest died, but rituals continued. A scribe died, but the tablets remain. A farmer died, but another farmer could continue the work. Human civilization therefore depended upon continuity rather than individual survival. The Sumerians and later Mesopotamian peoples lived among monuments, temples, objects, and traditions created by earlier generations. Their society depended on inherited knowledge. They received a structure and added to it. The same principle can be seen in religious traditions. A hymn could be copied. A divine name could be preserved. A ritual could be repeated. A story could be rewritten in another language or adapted by another city. This is why the distinction between physical labor and cultural work becomes important. A person digging a canal produces an immediate result. A person teaching a craft produces a skill that can survive. A scribe copying a myth preserves information that may continue for centuries. A temple ceremony repeated year after year creates continuity between generations. Human activity became capable of producing something that did not end when the worker stopped. The creation tradition never needs to state this directly for the historical consequence to become visible. The gods may have required human service within the mythological world, yet humans created the material systems through which that religious world could be remembered. This does not mean ancient people consciously planned to preserve their gods for future historians. They were maintaining their own society and traditions. The later consequence is what makes the story remarkable. Workers built institutions. Institutions preserved records. Records preserved names. Those names survived long after the original cities disappeared. Humanity's original purpose was therefore becoming something larger. Humans were not simply performing tasks for a divine world. They were creating a human world capable of carrying the memory of that divine world forward. But the most surprising part of this transformation had not yet happened. Thousands of years later, the gods would be forgotten by most people, while human records about them would remain. That reversal changes the entire question of why humanity mattered. The final reversal begins with a simple fact. The ancient gods did not leave their own written records. Human beings did. Every surviving name, hymn, prayer, royal inscription, and creation story reached the modern world through human hands. A person pressed signs into clay. Another person copied them. Another generation stored them. Centuries passed. Cities collapsed. Languages changed. Yet some tablets survived. This changes the meaning of human purpose in a way the original creation stories could never have anticipated. Within the myths, humans are created because the gods require their service. From the perspective of later history, however, humans became the reason those gods can still be known. The workers became witnesses. That is the deeper reversal. Human beings built temples where divine images were honored. They composed hymns describing divine power. They recorded festivals and offerings. Scribes preserved stories about creation, floods, kings, battles, and the relationships among the gods. Without those records, much of Mesopotamian religion would be inaccessible today. This does not mean humans were created specifically to preserve divine memory. The ancient texts do not make that claim. The point is historical rather than prophetic. A society created for its own purposes produced records that eventually allowed a vanished religious world to survive in human memory. The gods may have been described as immortal. Their worshippers were not. Individual priests died. Kings died. Farmers died. Scribes died. Even entire cities could disappear. Yet the traditions could continue because each generation passed something to the next. A name was copied. A prayer was repeated. A ritual was performed again. A story was taught. Human mortality and cultural continuity existed side by side. This may explain why the ancient creation traditions are more interesting than a simple statement that humans were made to work. The work created conditions for society. Society created institutions. Institutions created records. Records created memory. The original task produced an unexpected legacy. Within that setting, humanity had a defined place. People worked the land. They maintained cities. They served temples. They performed rituals. They created records. They carried inherited knowledge into the future. The final question therefore becomes different from the one asked at the beginning. The issue is no longer simply why the gods needed workers. It is why human beings became so important to the survival of the traditions surrounding those gods. The answer lies in continuity. A deity could remain powerful within a myth, but a myth needed someone to transmit it. A temple could represent divine presence, but people had to maintain it. A sacred name could exist in tradition, but a scribe had to write it down. Human beings became the bridge between generations. The gods may have created humanity to serve the divine world. Humanity eventually became the keeper of its memory. This is where the title reaches its deepest meaning. Something else does not have to mean a secret technological mission or an unknown biological purpose. It can mean that human existence became larger than the task assigned to creation. Work produced society. Society produced culture. Culture produced memory, and memory allowed a forgotten world to speak again. The most striking irony is that the gods who were believed to command human beings now depend on surviving human records to remain visible to modern history. Their temples are ruins, their cities are buried, their languages require specialists, but their names remain. They remain because humans wrote them. That is the final answer the tablets cannot state directly. Humanity may have begun as a solution to a divine problem, but its greatest legacy was not the work it performed. It was the world of knowledge, culture, and memory that human beings created afterward. The gods needed humans to serve them. History needed humans to remember them forever. The ancient texts leave one final paradox. Humans may have entered the world to serve the gods, yet human hands became the reason those forgotten gods can still be remembered. The workers became witnesses, and their records survived. Watch the next ancient mystery to uncover another secret hidden inside Mesopotamia's oldest tablets.